Why does Mexico love soccer so much? As an American, that's a question that I've been asking a lot lately. Because growing up in the United States, soccer was always kind of there. Schools had teams. People watched the World Cup every few years. But if you asked most Americans to name the country's biggest sport, the answer is obvious: football. Maybe basketball, maybe baseball, soccer, not even part of the conversation. And then I moved to Mexico, and suddenly it felt like I was living in a completely different universe. Soccer wasn't just a sport, it was everywhere: on televisions, in restaurants, in conversations, in the park, in the schoolyards, in all of the neighborhoods. And it got me wondering, how did two neighboring countries end up caring so much about completely different sports? At first, I thought I knew the answer. Mexico likes soccer and America likes football. People have preferences. Mystery solved. Except that explanation doesn't explain anything, because almost every country on earth loves soccer. Brazil, Argentina, Spain, Germany, England, Japan, Morocco, Mexico. The list goes on and on. In fact, soccer is by far the most popular sport in the entire world, which creates much more interesting questions. If the entire world fell in love with soccer, why didn't America? That is the rabbit hole. And the deeper that I went, the stranger that it got. The first thing that I discovered is that Americans aren't actually as disconnected from soccer as what people think. Millions of kids play it. Youth soccer is massive, and the World Cup viewership is huge. Professional soccer keeps growing. So the story isn't that Americans hate soccer. Clearly they don't. But something happened that prevented soccer from becoming America's #1 sport. And that is something that starts with another sport: football. Because if you look closely at football and soccer, they aren't actually competing games. They're competing cultures. Think about soccer for a second. You need a ball. That's basically it. A field helps. Goals help. But kids will play with backpacks as goalposts if they have to. A dirt lot works. A park works. A street, a beach, all of it pretty much works almost anywhere. Soccer is probably the simplest major sport on earth, and that's the reason that it's spread everywhere. A kid in a wealthy neighborhood can play soccer, and a kid in a poor neighborhood can play soccer as well. A kid in Mexico City can play. A kid in a tiny village can play. The barrier entry is almost zero, and that is powerful. Before I keep going, I want to ask you guys something. What was the biggest sport in your neighborhood growing up? Not on TV, not like professionally. I just want to know outside what you guys were playing after school. I'm curious if that answer changes depending on what country you're from, because I think it explains more than what people can even realize. Now, compare that to football. Football is incredible, but football is complicated. You need equipment, you need helmets, you need pads, you need a lot of players, a structured field, a lot of organization. And that's one of the reasons that football never spread globally the way that soccer did. But that still doesn't explain why America chose football in the first place. And that's where things get really interesting, because football is not just a sport, it's almost a reflection of the American culture. Every player has a specialized role. Every play is planned. Every position has a specific responsibility. Everything is organized. Everything is strategic. Everything is measured. And then you look at soccer. Soccer is organized too, of course, but it's different. The game flows. The action rarely stops. Players constantly adapt. Control shifts back and forth. There's a certain unpredictability to it. And neither style is better. They're just completely different, which made me realize something. Maybe America didn't reject soccer. Maybe America simply found a sport that reflected the way that it already thought. But then I stumbled into one of my favorite discoveries during this entire rabbit hole, the word soccer. Because if you've ever spent time online, you've probably seen people making fun of Americans for calling it soccer. Apparently, we're not supposed to call it football, right? Well, not exactly, because Americans didn't invent the word soccer. The British did. Seriously. Back in the 1800s, there were multiple versions of football being played. One was rugby football. The other was association football. Students started shortening association football to soccer. And for a while, the British used the word too. Then Britain gradually shifted back to calling it football. America kept using the word soccer, and now somehow Americans get blamed for the word that Britain created. That might be one of the most British things I've ever heard. And discovering that made me realize something else. A lot of arguments people have about sports are not really about sports. They're about identity. Because when Mexico plays soccer, they aren't just cheering for a team. They're cheering for a flag, a city, a neighborhood, a memory, a family tradition. And then it hit me. Americans do the exact same thing, just different teams. Think about it. People inherit sports teams from their parents. People wear team colors. People gather with the family. People throw parties. People argue. People celebrate. People sometimes cry. The emotions are almost identical. The sports change. The human behavior doesn't. And that realization completely changed how I look at this question, because I started this investigation trying to understand why Mexico loves soccer. But what I ended up discovering was that soccer isn't really the point. Community is. Belonging is. Shared experiences are. The game is just an excuse. And once I started looking at it that way, football and soccer suddenly stopped feeling so different. A family gathering around a television in Mexico to watch a soccer match is not that different from a family gathering around a television in America to watch football. Different rules, different uniforms, different traditions, but the same human need. The need to belong to something larger than yourself. The need to share a story with other people. The need to feel connected. And maybe that's why sports survive generation after generation. Not because of the games, but because of what happens around the games. The conversations, the memories, the traditions, and the community. So why does Mexico love soccer so much? At first, I thought the answer was going to be simple. History, culture, popularity. But I think that the real answer is deeper than that. Mexico loves soccer because soccer became one of the ways people connect to each other. And if we're being fair, America isn't really any different. We chose a different game. Americans, do you think soccer will ever become America's #1 sport? And Mexicans, what do you think Americans misunderstand most about soccer culture in Mexico? Let me know in the comments. And if you really enjoyed going down this rabbit hole with me, subscribe. Because every week I seem to find another thing that makes America and Mexico look completely different on the surface, only to discover that they're often trying to solve the exact same human problem underneath. And I'm just a guy in Mexico trying to figure this all out at the same time you guys are. So I appreciate your time. Have an awesome day.